All right, let's jump into this deep dive, and today we're going to be looking at U.S.-Mexico relations. We're doing it a little differently this time. We've got a whole stack of articles, opinion pieces, all from the February 11, 2025 edition of the Mexican newspaper Excelsior. So we're not just getting the events, but the view from south of the border.
Yeah, it's like a snapshot in time. We can really get a feel for the mood, the nuances of the relationship at that specific moment.
Exactly. So by the end of this deep dive, you're going to have a much clearer picture of what's going on, where the tension points are, maybe even some glimmers of hope. Let's start with some breaking news that hit the Excelsior presses. Trump just announced a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports from Mexico. This isn't his first time playing the tariff card, is it?
No, not at all. Back in 2018, he imposed similar tariffs, and it kicked off a trade war with Mexico. They hit back with tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, and eventually, after some economic pain on both sides, they found a resolution. But this time around, there's a lot of uncertainty about how it's all going to shake out.
The Excelsior article quotes Trump's advisor, Peter Navarro, calling these steel and aluminum tariffs 2.0. He says they're needed to put an end to foreign dumping. What exactly does that mean, dumping? Sounds kind of messy.
Well, in international trade, dumping basically means a country's exporting goods at a price lower than their domestic market price, often even below the cost of production. The argument is that this can undercut domestic industries in the importing country, create an unfair advantage. Navarro saying Mexico's doing this, harming U.S. steel and aluminum producers, and these tariffs are meant to level the playing field.
So how's Mexico reacting to these tariffs?
Cautiously, at least for now. The Mexican government's waiting for the official details before they announce any countermeasures. But you can definitely sense the concern about the potential economic fallout, especially for industries that rely on these materials.
And if we look back to 2018, Mexico didn't hesitate to hit back with tariffs of their own. So there's a real possibility this could escalate into another trade war with ripple effects for both economies, even impacting consumers like you and me.
Absolutely. And this whole tariff thing comes right after another major point of tension, the fentanyl crisis. Trump's been very vocal, accusing Mexico of not doing enough to stop the flow of fentanyl into the U.S.
But Excelsior has this interview with Mike Vigil, former chief of international operations for the DEA, and he's got a very different take. He argues that Mexico can't just cut off the supply when the demand in the U.S. is so high. Vigil even says that most fentanyl comes through legal checkpoints, handled by U.S. citizens, not by, migrants crossing illegally. That's pretty surprising, isn't it?
Yeah, it challenges the usual narrative we hear. And to add to that, the Cato Institute reports that 86.3% of convicted fentanyl traffickers are U.S. citizens. So Vigil's point is that the U.S. needs to deal with its own demand problem before pointing fingers at Mexico.
He's also critical of Trump's call to deploy Mexican soldiers against the cartels, says it's just not an effective strategy. And he finds it contradictory that the U.S. would label cartels as terrorist organizations when it's U.S. citizens financing the fentanyl trade. It makes you wonder if this pressure on Mexico over fentanyl is somehow connected to Trump's trade agenda.
Yeah, it's hard not to see a potential link there. It's possible the fentanyl crisis is being used as leverage to get concessions on trade or other issues.
Okay, so we've got trade wars, drug wars, what else? Oh yeah, this next one feels like something out of a spy movie. CNN is reporting a surge in U.S. surveillance flights along the Mexican border. And we're not talking routine patrols here. We're talking U-2 spy planes, the kind designed for Cold War espionage, and P-8 Poseidon aircraft, which are usually used for submarine hunting.
This is where the technical details get really interesting. U-2s fly at incredibly high altitudes, so they can gather imagery and electronic intelligence from really far away. And P-8s have these sophisticated sensors that can detect and track submarines, but they can also be used to surveil surface activities.
So what are they looking for? Cartels, drug trafficking routes. Is this about gathering intel to support that terrorist designation for cartels?
It's certainly possible. Or maybe they're trying to give Mexican authorities information to encourage them to take action against the cartels. But some analysts are worried this could be a sign of something more serious, like preparing for potential U.S. military intervention in Mexico. Excelsior columnist Pascal Bertrand de Rio points out the huge difference in military capabilities between the U.S. and Mexico. He really highlights the advanced technology of these surveillance aircraft.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought. It raises some big questions about sovereignty and transparency in this relationship. If the U.S. is doing this level of surveillance, are they sharing the information with Mexico? And what does this mean for trust and cooperation between the two countries in the long run?
Those are questions the Mexican government and the public are wrestling with right now.
Now, on top of all of this, there's a political scandal unfolding in Mexico that adds another layer of complexity. Cuauhtémoc Blanco, the former soccer star, now a congressman, has been accused of attempted rape. And the timing of these accusations is suspicious, happening right when there was an attempt to remove the Morelos state prosecutor.
It feels like there's more to this story than meets the eye. The Excelsior coverage suggests there are power struggles and political motivations at play that go beyond the accusations themselves.
Like a political chess match, where every move has potential consequences for the broader U.S.-Mexico relationship.
Exactly, and it shows how internal politics in Mexico can have these ripple effects on the international stage.
So we've got trade wars, drug wars, surveillance, and political intrigue. It paints a pretty tense picture of the current state of U.S.-Mexico relations. But before we get too bogged down in the negative, I want to hear about some of the positive aspects of this relationship, because I know there are deep cultural connections that go beyond the political and economic headlines.
Absolutely, and that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore how cultural exchange, artistic expression, and shared history can act as a bridge between these two nations, even in the midst of challenges.
Sounds good to me. So we've covered some pretty heavy stuff. Tariffs, fentanyl, surveillance. It's clear U.S.-Mexico relations are facing some serious challenges right now.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's all happening with this backdrop of the upcoming U.S. election, which could really change the game.
So how is the election playing into all of this? What are people in Mexico saying about it?
Well, Excelsior has a bunch of opinion pieces that offer some interesting perspectives. Leo Zuckerman, a pretty prominent commentator, argues that Trump's unpredictable policies have made things really unstable. He points to the steel and aluminum tariffs as a prime example. Remember, Trump imposed similar tariffs back in 2018, then postponed them, then finally implemented them. It caused a lot of disruption for businesses on both sides of the border.
And it sounds like Zuckerman thinks these tariffs ultimately hurt both the U.S. and Mexican economies.
Yeah, he sees them as a form of protectionism that ends up hurting consumers and businesses in the long run. He thinks a more collaborative approach to trade would be way better for both countries.
That makes sense. So with the election coming up, what are the possible scenarios? Could a new administration take a less confrontational approach to Mexico?
That's the big question, isn't it? Some analysts think a new president might prioritize diplomacy and cooperation, but others are more skeptical. They say U.S. interests in Mexico, like trade and security, will always be top priorities, no matter who's in the White House.
I guess we'll have to wait and see how it all plays out. But no matter who wins, it's obvious that the U.S.-Mexico relationship has this long and complex history. It's marked by a power imbalance and a legacy of intervention. It's not something that can be fixed overnight.
You're absolutely right. And speaking of long-standing issues, we can't talk about U.S.-Mexico relations without talking about immigration. It's a topic that always seems to generate heated debate.
Excelsior has some really powerful coverage of the situation at the border, focusing on the human stories behind the headlines. One article describes the plight of migrants who are being apprehended and deported in increasing numbers. It even mentions that some migrants are arriving in Mexico with their hands cuffed, having been shackled by U.S. authorities during deportation. It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah, it's really concerning. It raises questions about the treatment of migrants and the potential for human rights violations. And it highlights the very real human cost of these policies.
Excelsior also sheds light on the issue of internal migration within Mexico, which adds another layer of complexity. People are fleeing violence and poverty in their home states, trying to find safety and opportunity elsewhere in the country.
It reminds us that the reasons people migrate are often deeply rooted in social and economic inequalities, both within Mexico and in the relationship between Mexico and the U.S.
The newspaper also has this opinion piece by Maximiliano Cortázar, a political analyst, who criticizes the Mexican government for being too accommodating to U.S. demands on immigration.
Right. Cortázar argues that the government is sacrificing Mexican sovereignty and the well-being of its citizens just to appease the U.S. He makes this interesting comparison. He says the relationship is like a business partnership where one partner, the U.S., constantly demands more from the other partner, Mexico, and the U.S. ignores the negative consequences for the partnership as a whole.
It's a thought-provoking argument that challenges the idea of a balanced and mutually beneficial relationship.
Exactly. And it reflects a growing feeling among some Mexicans that their government isn't standing up for their interests.
So far, we've talked about trade, drugs, immigration, and politics. It seems like every aspect of U.S.-Mexico relations is full of tension. But I'm curious if there are any bright spots, any signs of progress or positive developments.
Well, even with all the challenges, Excelsior does highlight some efforts to combat the fentanyl crisis through collaboration between U.S. and Mexican authorities. There have been some joint operations that have led to big drug seizures and disrupted trafficking networks.
So even with the political disagreements, there's still some cooperation on this issue.
Yeah, and it shows that working together can produce results even when things are really complex.
That's good to hear. What about on the cultural side? Are there any positive exchanges or collaborations happening there?
Absolutely. Excelsior has an article about Cristobal Marian, a Mexican composer. He's about to premiere a symphony inspired by the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. His work is seen as this powerful bridge between cultures and time periods, blending indigenous Mexican history with contemporary music.
That's really interesting. It sounds like he's creating a space for dialogue and reflection on shared history.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that cultural exchange can be really important for fostering understanding and empathy, especially when there's political tension.
I'm also struck by how much of the conversation around U.S.-Mexico relations focuses on the problems and the conflicts. It's easy to get caught up in the negative stuff, but it's important to remember that this relationship is multi-layered and complex. There are deep cultural ties, shared history, and tons of examples of cooperation and collaboration happening every day.
I totally agree. As we move into the last part of our deep dive, I think it's important to keep that broader perspective in mind. We'll be exploring how cultural connections and shared experiences can help bridge divides and create a more positive and productive relationship between the U.S. and Mexico.
Sound good to me. Let's dive in. Okay, so we've talked about all the political and economic stuff, but I really want to dig into something we touched on earlier, those cultural connections. It's easy to get lost in the headlines and forget about all the shared history, art, and traditions between these two countries.
Yeah, for sure. And Excelsior does a good job of highlighting that side of things, like that article about Cristobal Marian, the Mexican composer who's premiering a symphony inspired by the fall of Tenochtitlan.
Right, right. It's not just a historical piece, though, is it?
Oh, definitely not. Marian blends indigenous Mexican history with these modern musical elements. It's like a reflection on the past and a commentary on the present, all at the same time. Using music as this universal language to connect cultures and time periods?
I bet it brings up a lot of complex emotions, especially for Mexican audiences.
Absolutely. It's a reminder of the shared heritage between Mexico and the US, but it also speaks to the resilience of Mexican culture, how it's endured through so much.
It makes me think about how powerful art can be, especially during times of political tension. It can help us understand each other, build empathy. And speaking of cultural exchange, Excelsior also talks about Kitazawa Hideta, a Japanese artist who makes these incredible no theater masks.
Oh, yeah, those are amazing. It's a good reminder that cultural connections go way beyond just the US and Mexico. It's this whole global network of influences and inspirations.
Those masks are so intricate and expressive, they can convey so much emotion.
Yeah, and they change with the movements of the performer. It's like the masks themselves are alive.
It makes me think about how the U.S.-Mexico relationship is always changing, too. It's shaped by all these interactions, collaborations, shared experiences.
Exactly. It's dynamic, multifaceted, full of complexities.
It's so easy to focus on the negative stuff, the conflicts, and the disagreements. But we can't forget about the human element. There are real people, real connections, a shared humanity that goes beyond borders.
Couldn't agree more. That's what gives me hope for the future of this relationship.
Me too. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the tough stuff, the tensions, but also the resilience and the deep cultural connections between the U.S. and Mexico.
We've seen how history, politics, economics, and culture all intertwine to create this complex and constantly evolving relationship.
And we've seen it from a different angle through the lens of the Mexican newspaper Excelsior, which has given us some valuable insights into how these issues are seen south of the border.
I hope this deep dive has given you a more nuanced understanding of U.S.-Mexico relations, and maybe even something to think about, how we can all contribute to a better future for both countries.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep searching for those deeper connections that bring us all together.